You'll see them in any big city if you know the right streets or neighborhoods. Women and men who offer sex for cash. Except for a few Nevada counties, prostitution is against the law in the United States. And that includes those who buy as well as those who sell sex. Has it made a difference? Ask any cop. Last August, Amnesty International called on governments around the world to decriminalize the sex trade. It argued that laws against prostitution have only pushed the industry underground and increased the risk to sex workers themselves. Amnesty says there are compelling human rights reasons for its stand. Bringing the sex trade out of the shadows would protect what it calls one of the world's most marginalized group of workers from exploitation. And by the way, Amnesty's proposal for lifting penalties does not apply to traffickers, who it still believes should have the book thrown at them. Later this month, Amnesty's board is expected to develop concrete policy recommendations for governments. Will governments pay attention? A lot of people hope they won't. Celebrities like Gloria Steinem and Marcia Gay Harden are among 600 prominent individuals around the world who signed an open letter warning that removing criminal penalties for both the buyers and the sellers of sex would be a backward step. They argue it will increase trafficking and make it likely that more vulnerable people, including children, will become victims of the exploitation Amnesty says it wants to end. The arguments are passionate on both sides, but research and field evidence can help us find a foothold in this debate, even though it may not resolve it. Our guest on Criminal Justice Matters today brings some scholarship to this issue. Samantha Majic teaches political science at John Jay College. Her most recent volume is called Sex Work Politics. Welcome, Samantha.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with some basics. Let's define what legalization means as opposed to decriminalization.
So legalization and decriminalization are often confused, obviously, in public discourse. So legalization refers to a specific legal regime, a system of regulation. So the best example of that might be the Netherlands, for example, where prostitution is legalized and regulated in brothels. So people need a license to work there, certain numbers of health checks. There's a very specific set of regulations around the sex industry. Whereas decriminalization basically means that prostitution in this case is not criminalized. So it's an activity that, like any other decriminalized activity, that you can just do. And it would be, for those who engage in it, it would be regulated like any other business. So if you're an independent sex worker, you file your taxes as an independent employee.
So what's the rap against legalization? I mean, it certainly gives the state a lot more involvement in the sex industry and the sex trade. And one would think, at the same time, would bring protections, including health protections, legal protections, and all the things that you would need, I would assume, if you are a sex worker.
So yeah, in my study of the sex worker rights movement in the U.S., this has been an issue that they've been very divided about, sex workers themselves. Some sex workers think legalization is a great idea. There are many who've enjoyed working in the Nevada brothel system, which is the closest thing in the U.S. to a legal system. But others, I think, rightly point to the amount of state intervention in people's lives that this will bring, and particularly in women's lives. And so who gets to set and decide the regulations? We don't, and this is a problem, we don't give sex workers a big hand in developing the policies that affect them, like we do many other workers in other industries. And so there are a lot of divisions between, if we were to regulate the industry, what would this involve, what would be best for the community, and who would get to determine those regulations. And that's a big
So
question.
Amnesty, as I said in the opening, does call this the most marginalized group of workers. And what does that mean? I mean, do you agree with that?
Absolutely. So especially in the United States, where prostitution is almost uniformly criminalized everywhere except certain Nevada counties, sex workers can't be open for the most part about what they do, whether it's to their healthcare providers. A lot of them fear judgment. They fear that they might be arrested. Shame and stigma might make them afraid to be out to their families and friends. And not, of course, all sex workers are not targeted equally by law enforcement either. So particularly for transgender women of color, they're the most likely to be arrested and subject to our current criminalization regime.
Big part of the argument seemed to be centered around who gets to control women's bodies. I mean, do women themselves have control over what they do and can decide to get into sex work or not? And from what I gather, the opponents of the Amnesty Decriminalization proposal say that by removing criminal penalties from everyone involved in the sex trade, you're just making it worse for sex workers and leaving them as victims, in effect. Do you buy that?
I don't buy that, actually. Whether you're criminalizing just the clients or just the sex workers or both groups, you're still criminalizing. And what criminalization does is it drives the activity underground. And so criminalizing the buyers is not going to make them want to stop buying sex necessarily. So they may just go to a different jurisdiction to purchase it. They may also go to more out-of-the-way locations, which make it less safe for sex workers to work.
But why wouldn't it? If you raise the fines, as I understand it, are pretty much pats on the hand right now. But if you raise them substantially, as I think some jurisdictions have done, wouldn't that sort of get make Johns think in a different direction? Say, I'm not doing this.
Well, I mean, how well does any deterrence like that work for any other crime, right? And generally not that well. People still steal, people still commit all kinds of other things we define as crimes. And again, with the demand for sex, what happens is people are more likely to just go and find it somewhere else or in a more out-of-the-way location. So they're not going to, for example, solicit someone on the street where you're the most likely to be arrested. That's where the cops do most of their stings. You're maybe going to go online or look for or work with indoor workers.
I guess another issue is whether sex work itself is really voluntary. So the arguments of those who are against, again, the amnesty proposal, say one can't consider as a woman makes a normal choice, even though she does choose to sell her body for cash, but that's really not an independent choice because she's forced by economic reasons or personal reasons or health reasons. She's an addict or whatever, and she doesn't really have control over that. So we shouldn't consider sex work a service as we do maybe other kinds of work.
Most people engage in sex work for the same reason that we all go to work. I mean, unless some of us have a trust fund here, we all have to make money somehow. And some people are differently positioned to take advantage of different economic opportunities. And so, you know, to say that this isn't a choice, everybody makes choices under constrained circumstances. I love my job, but I also do it because I need money. Does that make me someone who's coerced into my work? Also, to say that women can't freely choose or make a decision under constrained circumstances is incredibly patronizing, I think. And so commonly, you know, we accuse women in the sex industry who say that they like their work or that they made this decision. We say that they have a false consciousness. And again, I think this is incredibly patronizing, and it puts the blame on the individual as opposed to looking at the conditions that brought them to doing sex work.
But some people just don't like the idea of selling sex for money.
Yes.
So it's a moral question.
We're a very puritanical society, too. I mean, we can't even talk about sex education in schools in this country and talk about condom use without people going crazy.
Well, let's move to that. Just the wider issue of health issues, education.
Yeah.
Many of the women who are sex workers, whether they're trafficked or whether they go, they're self-employed, so to speak, they still have a huge array of health problems, and many of them get in, even if some of them very, very young, because there's no other alternatives. They're runaways. I mean, you know the cases better than I would. So what are we actually doing to remedy or intervene with the women who, for whatever reasons, are in sex work but desperately need help?
Well, so this is one of the problems, is that we have a healthcare system in this country, if we're going to talk about occupational health and safety, that's broken for everybody, whether you're a sex worker or not, right? And so for sex workers, you have this additional burden of doing something that is stigmatized. And so there have been a lot of efforts over the years, and this is what my own research is focused on, to engage sex workers, and sex workers have taken it on themselves to deal with their occupational health and safety issues in their community. So two of the most notable examples are the St. James Infirmary in San Francisco, which is an occupational health and safety clinic that's run by and for sex workers. And the other is the California Prostitutes Education Project, and they take a mobile van.
And this is what you did your studies on?
Yeah. And so in these cases, it's sex workers themselves deciding what they need to stay safe and healthy. And the advantage of this is that they know their needs best. And when sex workers are doing outreach and health work with other sex workers, they're more likely to trust each other because they won't be judged. And so this has proven incredibly effective. Unfortunately, there are just far too few examples like that across the country. And we still have this belief that sex workers are vectors of disease, quote unquote, into the community, which is patently untrue. I mean, that was proven back in the early 80s when the HIV epidemic appeared in the heterosexual community. Everybody thought it was sex workers, and that wasn't true.
A lot of your work was directly with sex workers, with the women, and I guess you work with men as well.
Men and transgender, yep.
So what did they tell you? I mean, what are their voices? We don't have them, unfortunately, on the program with today, but maybe through you, tell us a little bit about what they feel, what their voices are, insofar as you can talk about it.
So what I can say is I met an incredibly diverse array of people, and none of them met the stereotype of the weak victim who was trapped and forced to do this against his or her will. And so, you know, I met everybody from street-based sex workers who traded sex because of drug addiction, through to mothers who maybe had sex with a neighbor in order to pay for a birthday party to their kid, all the way to higher-end call girls who did bondage and domination work for thousands of dollars. So there's a huge spectrum of activity there. We tend to focus in the media and in public policy discussions on the very extreme case of the young girl trapped in the van. That's really what we've come to focus on lately.
This is an incredibly passionate issue on both sides. But most of the sex workers that you've talked to are in favor of the general amnesty law. Amnesty proposal, rather.
Definitely, yes. I mean, and I was working with sex workers who were in sex worker right organizations, but all of them have seen the negative implications of criminalization in their own lives, whether they've been arrested themselves or forced to work in dangerous underground conditions because, you know, they couldn't work safely, they didn't want to be arrested. And that has impacts on their own health and safety.
But realistically, since you're an expert in the politics of sex work, what chance do we have, really, of getting the ideas proposed by Amnesty International into legislation around the world? I mean, it's a long step between what they're saying and what would have to happen from each government. Clearly,
well, and given, you know, the United States' general reluctance to sign on to a lot of international treaties, for example, we are not a signatory of the Convention to Eliminate Discrimination Against Women, right? This is a long shot, and it's hard to get any politician to stand up and say, you know, I support decriminalizing prostitution. They'll be called a pervert, they'll be called a pimp. You know, this is not something that a lot of legislators are going to run and jump on.
Not an issue we'll see on this campaign,
No,
I think.
Absolutely
but
not.
Certainly worth following.
Absolutely.
Samantha, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. This was great.
It's a pleasure. Whichever side you take in the decriminalization debate, it's hard to ignore the fact that the sex industry today is big business. Its dimensions worldwide are impossible to know. But Meredith Dank of the Urban Institute has spent much of the past decade examining the trade in the U.S. The results of her research have been eye-opening and in some cases disturbing. She joins our discussion today. Meredith, welcome to Criminal Justice Matters.
Thank you.
So, in the last segment, we were talking about the prevalence of laws against prostitution. In the United States, almost uniformly bans it. But yet, your research, as I understand it, shows that it's flourishing, particularly underground. Tell us a little bit about what you found.
I don't think that flourishing underground, it's hard to, our study looks specifically at the economy side of this. So how much money is being made, particularly in the 8 cities that we focused on. You know, we looked over a span of 5 years, how the market has changed in those 5 cities. And in only 2 of the cities, it actually increased over that 5-year period. We couldn't figure out exactly, we didn't have the time or the money to determine exactly why the economy dropped over those 5 years in the majority of the cities. However, you know, it's something that definitely the overall economy could play into it. You know, how things have shifted to the internet could play a role in that as well, and also law enforcement attention on the issue.
The cities were? Tell us what they were.
The 8 cities were Denver, Seattle, San Diego, Kansas City, Atlanta, Miami, Washington, D.C., and Dallas.
Yeah, that makes sense. I count 8. Let me see. I guess the point of my question was that it's against the law in all those places, and yet that hasn't seemed to make a dent in the. There may be other factors for why it's gone down economically, but hasn't seemed to make an effect in the practice of it. Would that be fair to say? I mean, people are still doing it regardless of whether
people are
there's a law
definitely still
against
doing
it or
it.
not.
We don't know the scope. There's been no research. It's virtually impossible to actually estimate how many people are actually involved in prostitution, and within that, how many are actually sex trafficked. So without really knowing that, it's hard to determine if there are more people entering it. I think that there are assumptions that have been made because the internet has facilitated that. However, it's really impossible to know to what extent.
One of the things we were looking at with the last guest was whether sex work should be qualified as a choice that a woman makes, or really because of the economic circumstances she's under or social circumstances that it's really, or of course she may be trafficked, that it's really not a voluntary choice. It's not the kind of service that you provide, say, in McDonald's or anything else.
So first I need to say that it's not an issue that only women are only involved in. My research is actually focused a lot on men and transgender individuals as well.
I want to talk about that.
But what I typically look at is it's a continuum. And so you've got individuals on one side of the continuum who are forced into it, frauded, coerced into it, which fits under the definition of trafficking. On the other side, you do have individuals who have full agency and choice over their engaging in the commercial sex trade. But I think what's often left out is that gray area in the middle, where there's individuals who have constrained choice, who really have no other options to have their basic needs met, food, shelter, that sort of thing. And so this is something that they feel they have no choice but to do. And they are the ones who are often criminalized.
You haven't taken a stand in your study, and that wasn't the purpose of it, either for or against the amnesty proposal. But do you think decriminalization would make their lives easier for those people that you talk to?
Yes. To what extent? I think it's hard because there are certain places around the world that have decriminalized it, and there really hasn't been a lot of research to show the effects of that decriminalization and how that has impacted the individuals involved in it. But at least with the research that I've done, and particularly the young people, because most of my research is focused on youth, their cycling in and out of the criminal justice system is what is actually pushing them further into engaging in this.
That's very interesting. A lot of the conclusions or the discoveries that you made in your study really shocked a lot of people, or surprised a lot of people. One of them is that a lot of the prostitution, sex work, such as it is now, goes out on the internet. That it's not, it's not in the back streets, although it is to some extent, but not in the same way it was 20 years ago.
Correct. I mean, the internet has, helped facilitate a lot of things. You could be pretty much anywhere, particularly here in the U.S., log on somewhere and find somebody and arrange a date that way. And so it's become a big focus for law enforcement. They've focused more on the internet as a result. But I think it's also been harder to kind of enforce laws around that. It's been hard because there is so much flooding within the internet. Where some of the individuals we spoke to for the sex economy study, they said that because there's so much attention now on the internet, they're starting to rethink, okay, maybe we do go back to the streets, maybe we figure out other venues.
Well, do people who go on the internet, could they be considered part of the sex economy? I mean, they may only be going on once. They want to make some money quickly and then go back to whatever they were doing, office work or whatever else. I mean, are they effectively part of the sex economy, or is it in fact that it's such a shifting
It
kind of
is,
definition?
and again, a lot of my research is focused on young people who do this to survive, and it's kind of like a roller coaster. It might be periods of your life where you are stable, where you don't need that income, and there are other ways in which you can get your needs met. But this is always something in the back of their minds, as if times get hard, this is something that I can do, and the internet just helps facilitate that.
Well, can you tell us about what you found about the young people who've gotten involved in the sex economy? What does it mean to them?
And I think it depends. Again, looking at that continuum, there were some young people who really were in extremely vulnerable situations. Maybe they were cycling in and out of the child foster care system, had run away from abuse, or in the case of LGBTQ youth, they were kicked out of their homes because of their sexual orientation and gender identity, and really didn't have a place to go. And maybe the first person that they met was indeed a pimp, and that's how they got involved initially. But what we found is oftentimes it was other peers that were engaging this for survival, that kind of taught them the ropes. They weren't expecting anything monetarily in exchange for that. They weren't benefiting in any way. It's just young people helping young people to survive.
Does child pornography classify as part of the sex economy? It's not, I guess it's not sex work in the way we customarily think of it, but it's certainly part of the underground.
I think child pornography, if you look, yes, it is child pornography looking at it separately and those people who are involved in it. It's not really for profit. So I did speak to some individuals who've been arrested on child pornography charges in prison, and very few of them had actually been profiting from the production of it. It's more of a trade that they do, and it's really hard to compare that to things like the internet and sex work and things of that sort, because they're two very different economies, if you can call that an economy.
Were there things you discovered that in your study that you had not expected to find?
In the sex economy study? I think it was interesting because this was the first, I think, full-scale study that did a lot of interviews with individuals who've been convicted on pimping, pandering, trafficking charges that are in prison now. And I think just hearing from their perspective, kind of how they got involved, I think a lot of people inherently think that they're monsters, right, that these are evil people, but for a lot of the individuals I spoke with, they came from similar backgrounds as the people who are actually engaging in the sex work themselves.
Have they been abused themselves? Is that the...
Some of them. I mean, some of it's normalized within either their community or their family. Their father might have been a pimp, or their mother might have been engaged in sex work, or somebody in their family. And this is something that was just how food was on the table. This is something that they just grew up with. Same normalized within their community. So they didn't really understand that. To some degree they did, because that's something they talked about in the interviews, but to the extent of that this is a crime and kind of the assaults and other things that individuals might experience while engaging in this, that didn't really factor so much in their
You
mind.
estimated that the value of the underground economy was anywhere from between in the hundreds of millions, but you had a wide range between, I think it was 6 million to 120 million, or correct me if I'm wrong.
It wasn't as little as 6 million. I think the lowest maybe 49 million, although I can't say that I remember it exactly off the top of my head. But the largest was Atlanta with $290 million that we estimated was made in 2007.
That's in 1 year. Mm-hmm. And should we assume that's gotten only bigger since then?
It's hard to say. I mean, Atlanta has cracked down a lot to the extent of looking at sex trafficking and arrests and things of that sort. So again, these are things really hard to measure, and without a continuation to see how it's increased or decreased over time, it's hard to say.
You're working on a study now. What's the study you're doing now?
I'm working on a lot of studies, but a report that we're releasing next week actually is a second report looking at LGBTQ youth and their engagement in survival sex here in New York City. And what we're releasing next week is specifically looking at their interactions with both criminal justice and child welfare systems and how that has impacted their lives and kind of pushed them again further into engaging in this.
You focused on these 8 cities, but can you make any generalizations? How would you apply what you found in any sort of general way to what you think is happening in the U.S. overall in terms of the sex economy?
Again, that's really hard to say. The method that we developed to estimate the economy in each of those cities is, you can't just extrapolate based on that. You have to do it for each individual city, which is why we only were able to do it in those 8 cities. So to say, if this is the trend or this is, on par with other cities in the U.S., it's really hard to say.
Meredith, thanks very much.
Thank you.
When you think about it, the debate over decriminalizing sex work has a familiar ring. As a nation, we've been immersed in an equally passionate debate about decriminalizing marijuana. The arguments pro and con have touched many of the same points. Opponents say eliminating criminal penalties for marijuana use, not to mention harder drugs, increases the risk of addiction for the most vulnerable. Advocates say it will go a long way towards ending the trafficking that has left so many victims in its wake. That debate is far from settled. But here's one thing we do know. Our current criminalization policy, we call it the war on drugs, has filled our prisons with no discernible effect on reducing addiction. And it hasn't stopped the traffickers. I'm Steve Handelman. Thanks for watching. See you next time.